Thank you very much for being here. Today I'm going to speak about explanatory profiles of models of consciousness. So let's start with a few motivations. In neuroscience of consciousness or in studies of consciousness, we always tend to start from assumptions like materialism or physicalism. So in this one, the idea is that the mind emerged in the best case, or sometimes it's just reduced to the internal computations of the brain. So here we see like the computational metaphor of the brain, for example, things like that. But it's not the only kind of assumptions. We also have the idealistic assumption, where it's quite the opposite. It's the physical domain or the biological domain which emerge from the mind. And these two assumptions are perfectly valid in scientific and philosophical context. But we will probably expect something more like in between these two things. And this is the idea of continental phenomenology, which is trying to bracket the assumptions, the physicalist assumption and the idealistic assumption, and try to study what is the mutual constraint between the mind and the biological brain in a way that they are not dualistic. And the interesting part of this type of philosophy, it's that you can connect it with process philosophy. So then you don't need to focus on properties, but more in changes. We are going to see how some of these assumptions are related with models of consciousness. So the paper here, Explanatory Profiles of Models of Consciousness towards Systemic Classification, is the paper with Joanna and Robert, and we will go in some details about these possibilities. So I would like to start with this very bad question. I would say that it's not the best way to formulate the question because the definition of consciousness, it's not very clear. There are different connotations of consciousness, different way to approach what is consciousness. But actually the problem is not with the consciousness word, it's actually with the what is. So the what is something, whatever it is, it's claiming for an explanation. But in order to explain something, we need to first define what we mean by explaining consciousness in this case. Or even like the next step, it's actually to define what is a satisfactory explanation. But then when we try to define what is a satisfactory explanation to answer this question of what is consciousness, we actually need to first start for what is an explanation at all. It's a worth question to ask, but I think that we need to go deep on what we are trying to say behind. So the next idea is that models of consciousness try to answer that question or explain consciousness relating the physical domain and the conscious experience domain, the mind, the mental domain. And there are hundreds of models of consciousness. We decided to focus on a few of them, and still each month, perhaps, or each a couple of months, there is some new paper claiming a new model of consciousness, but most of them, they share common assumptions, and we can eventually group them together. So one first step is try to define how the models of consciousness are related to the three ideas that we mentioned before. Monism, which has the variants of physicalism, idealism, dual aspect monism, etc. Phenomenology, and something that I didn't mention at the beginning, but but everyone is kind of aware of that, dualism. And interesting thing is that if we read different models of consciousness, independently of sometimes what is said explicitly, but also we try to understand what implies, then we can see that most of the models of consciousness, which is not something new, come from a physicalist perspective. And this is interesting because sometimes there are models like neuroscientific models of consciousness that claim to be more precise in certain definitions about the neurons, etc., and the relation with consciousness. But the type of assumptions behind the models are very similar to assumptions like quantum models in Penrose and Hameroff model, for example. So this is the first thing that we can see. And we also see here like how new models, like what we call modern models of consciousness, are related to previous ones. But it's not only physicalism which has an impact in models of consciousness. There is also some models like radical embodiment that follow phenomenology, continental phenomenology, and Buddhist philosophy. There is certain influence of this type of phenomenology in IIT, although it's not always explicit. And IIT, which is explicit in terms of the physicalism, also it's implicitly connected with some type of versions of IIT are implicitly connected with panpsychism, for example. And some versions would say, or some people would say, that new versions of IIT could still be connected with idealism or some variants of idealism. And in this side of the corner, there is a model called conscious agent model or conscious agent network that actually claims that the physical domain can emerge from the mental one, and they define certain mathematical ways to explore this potential assumption. So this is like the first picture. It's not a complete picture. We can add many different models, and perhaps we can also add different variants, different connections here, but it's a first view of how these models relate to these philosophical ideas. And the main point here is that we need to be explicit about these connections. Most of the cases, these connections are not always 100% implicit. Certain models tend to be more precise about the connections with the philosophical domain than others. So the next step, it's try to classify these models. And in order to do that, we did this classification map, where the first axis is what we call the mode of explanation. So basically, it's what is the aim of the model and what is a satisfactory explanation for the model. And you have two possibilities here. Of course, you have many others, but we decided to go for these two: mechanistic explanations and unificationist explanations. So basically, the first one is the type of explanation that needs or presumes the causal effect story. So something A causes another B, whatever it is, and the causation is realistic. In most of the cases of this type of explanation, there is a bottom-up approach. It means that you accumulate evidence and then you define or came up with your explanation, mechanistic explanation. In the other side, there is unificationist explanations or accounts. They tend to be top-down, so you define your explanation, your hypothesis mathematically or with other tools, and then you try to test that hypothesis. And the explanation could be causal or could be no causal. And it's interesting, one unificationist example, it's the Maxwell unification of electricity and magnetism. The unificationists tend to be mathematical explanations where you, using certain type of mathematics, you tend to combine aspects of one phenomenon that weren't so obvious before than you came up with that unificationist account. So most of the, for example, biological explanations tend to be in terms of mechanisms. So a bottom-up approach is when you accumulate evidence from different experiments in order to define what would be your explanation of all of them. In the other way, in the other side, a top-down approach would be one that well, of course, you will need certain experiences or experiments, but you will try to define an hypothesis driven by a theory or an assumption that then you could prove. Maybe it's a counterintuitive assumption, or maybe it's a counterintuitive consequence that you could observe in a new experiment. So you need to define or redefine certain ways of doing experiments in order to test this new account. So the second one, the second axis, it's the mechanism of explanation. So what are the tools of the models, or how the model try to explain something? In this case, of course, we are speaking about conscious experience. So in this case, functional models tend to assume that consciousness would emerge from functional mechanisms. So any system with the right function, it can be or has the potentiality to become a conscious system. And this implies, mathematically speaking, that could be certain homomorphisms between the physical system and the conscious system. On the other side, it's causal models that would claim that actually consciousness would emerge only from the right causal structure. the right causal system interactions, the internal interactions of the system. And in this case, there is the implication would be that it's an isomorphism between the physical system and conscious system. You can imagine like a black box where you have some inputs and outputs. So basically, you don't actually care too much, or you assume that you cannot go inside of that black box, but you see that you have some inputs and certain outputs that would be the result of the function that you have in that box. So basically, models that claim to be functional models assume that you don't need to define all the causal interaction or the internal causal interaction. You just need to define the function. What is consciousness doing, or what is the black box doing in order to get consciousness? That's a huge difference, although it doesn't seem too huge, but it is, with a causal model that would claim that you need to define the internal structure. And the internal structure is actually going in deep into the black box. So then it's not just a relationship between inputs and outputs. You need to unfold, that's the way how some theories say it, unfold the structure. And this structure will be, or would have certain connections with experience. And the next one, the final axis is the target of explanation. So what is the phenomena that we try to explain? And here we can identify at least two, perhaps there are more, but the first one is quality. So what makes an experience auditory, painful, or temporal, for example. And the second one is quantity, which is for us, what makes the system conscious versus unconscious. All these things are, well, they are kind of related with all the discussions that we had during this yesterday and today. So having like this classification map with these three different axes and explanation, let's try now to put some models inside of this classification map. This is the first picture that we decided after different tries to get the variability in some sense. But for example, many models are actually, they target the two things, the quality and quantity, for example. So that's the case of IIT, but in order to make them has opposite directionalities here, we needed to sacrifice certain deepness of the analysis. You could try to guess where is global neural workspace, for example, in this picture, where is IIT, where is predictive processing, where is other models that are your, I don't know, your favorite model here in the picture about the models. It's this one, more or less, what we got from our own discussions, etc. But it's something that we would like to put in the table to discuss, and we would like to extend and expand the classification, the access, the way how we defined it. Some of the models in some areas are not, or not in others, etc. Global neural workspace, for example, it's a functional mechanistic model targeting quantity mainly. And IIT, it's a causal model which tends to be unificationist by the type of explanations that they bring. And we here put it in quality, although of course IIT has two components, quality and quantity. And also some people would say that actually global neural workspace, it's moving to a more causal type of explanation. These are the type of experiments that people in the global neural workspace community are starting to do, causal manipulation of the brain, etc. So that's the idea of this classification map, to have a big picture or a quick picture of how these models target different explanation of different phenomena. And having this, we now can discuss a few implications very, very quickly. So, of course, the first implication is that satisfactory explanations are different across different models. So what it means to explain something, it would be different for IIT than for global neural workspace, or even for quantum models or conscious agent network model, for example. So this is something that we need to take into consideration if we want to do whatever experiments or theoretical discussions about the models. Then there is something that it's even perhaps more important, which is that focus on mechanisms only does not falsify the models. And this is very interesting because, for example, there is a huge debate about localization. But actually, the localization of certain areas or even networks makes not much sense unless that you have a model that it's mechanistic and causal at the same time, but not for other type of models. And the interesting thing is that most of the models of consciousness are dynamic network approaches that doesn't entail locationist accounts. So it's a no localist in principle. There is also evidence that seems very compatible between different models. The PCI, for example, that it's claimed to be inspired by IIT, and it is actually. The results that you get from PCI analysis are perfectly compatible with global neural workspace. The recent results about the layer 5, it's very compatible with different models, DBS, etc. There are many different experiments that could be compatible between models of consciousness, and therefore the neural evidence that comes from them. And finally, probably the most important is that evidence for mechanisms at any particular level does not falsify the relevance of other mechanisms at other levels. And this is probably the most common example. In IIT, you have a role of the silent single units that cannot be falsifiable by the role of active units, or even the role of a group of neurons. So you need to look into these single units and how they interact with the rest of the system in order to falsify that mechanism. And even worse, there is not a single neuroscientific experiment or proof that can falsify models like conscious agent model. Although this conscious agent model, it's falsifiable, but by other means, by mathematical and theoretical means. And you could perfectly falsify this model, but not with the same type of experiments than neuroscience of consciousness. And finally, we see that different models target different explanations. So the models intend to explain different phenomena. And we think that it's very important, in order to escape of this difference between models, we need a methodological consensus, because different targets require different methods. So we need first, second, and third person methods in order to target different aspects. Our conclusions is that to ask the question, what is an explanation, is very relevant in order to answer the question, what is consciousness? Also, it's very relevant in order to understand models of consciousness and try to compare them and try to do experiments to falsify them, etc. But also we need to distinguish between essential components and accessory components of a theory or models of consciousness. And these accessory components sometimes are some aspects of the mechanism that they propose, and we should focus on the essential ones. In order to do that, we need integrative methods. Probably dynamical system theory would help us in order to understand how different models connect each other. Axiomatic mathematics, it's a very new type of tool that it's starting to be implemented in the neuroscience of consciousness, and it's very good to make the philosophical assumptions more transparent. My guess that would be that using these three things together, dynamical system, axiomatic mathematics, and more philosophical transparency, would help us to integrate better models and methods. So the future work here is extend the classification that we discussed. The ideal case is also testing models based on the underlying assumptions, like, for example, for some models, representations, silent units for IIT. There are some experiments that are trying to target these things. But eventually, I think that we will come up with an integration of models. Our guess is that this group here can be integrated, and with a little bit more effort, some theories like this could be also be integrated. But in order to finally integrate the two extremes in some sense, you will need this group of theories here. And for me, these four could be like the most promising ones in order to deal with the metaphysical claims and the pragmatical, the usefulness of the models as well, etc. So this is the end. I hope that we didn't take too much time, but if you would like to collaborate or discuss more about these things, just send me an email here. And thank you very much for your time.